That was the head of the nursing union, Pat Cullen, asking for a meeting with the UK Prime Minister. He says he's not budging, but a junior health minister vowed to keep emergency services functioning, even as he advised Britons to avoid what he termed risky activity.
Will be disruption to service, and it is important that where people are planning any risky activity, I would strongly encourage them not to do so, because there will be disruption on the day. But the key thing is for anybody that does have an emergency situation or a life-threatening situation, that they continue to call 999 as they would have done previously.
That's Will Quince, who's a junior health minister in Britain. Well, let's cross over to London, where Arise business correspondent Laurie Laird has been monitoring events. So good to see you, Laurie. What's the latest? Any sign of a settlement?
Not a bit of it, Charles, but at least we have that junior health minister telling us to, avoid rugby training tomorrow. I mean, telling people to avoid risky activity isn't all that reassuring, is it? But no, not a chance of absolutely no talks at all between the nurses and the government. There were a number of talks between the various unions that represent ambulance drivers who will go on strike tomorrow. All of those unions walked away saying that this was not a particularly constructive meeting. So the ambulance driver strike is on tomorrow. And curiously, the hospitals seem much, much more worried about this ambulance strike than they do the nurses' strike. And in fact, many healthcare providers have written to the heads of the National Health Service saying, we are deeply concerned about what may happen tomorrow in the case of serious injury. They are saying that in life or death situations, ambulance drivers will be willing to discharge their duties. There is talk that some military have been drafted in, but it very, very much feels that the health authorities are extremely concerned about tomorrow.
And I mean, you mentioned the need to avoid risky behavior. I'm wondering how chaotic the hospitals are today.
It's a very good question, Charles, and I've spoken to a number of people who are involved in the health business, doctors, nurses. They are saying it's not quite as bad as they had expected. The nurses were fairly forgiving with these two strikes over the past weeks. They were very clear about which hospitals would be on strike and which wouldn't. So anyone seeking emergency care was aware, and emergency care was preserved. But of course, some of those where emergency care was preserved, some of those wards, some of those units were very much more crowded than they would have been. Dialysis, life-saving treatment, chemotherapy, that was all retained. And nurses were very clear about what services would be preserved and which would not. Also, not every NHS trust or organization that had voted to strike opted to do so. The nurses, I think, very aware of how public opinion can change very quickly in these situations. Last poll I saw, 63% of those polled are supporting the nurses. That is a little bit higher than we're seeing for postal workers and we're seeing for train drivers. So they are aware that completely withdrawing services may be not beneficial to the public image. But the nurses have said that strikes that they are planning for early next year will be much more widespread.
Well, that's what I was going to talk to you about, Laurie, because I don't quite recall this frequency of strikes from the people who work for the NHS. I mean, what are the sticking points to a possible deal?
Well, you're right, Charles. And I remember a couple of junior doctor strikes, which didn't last very long. But this is, as you hinted, the very first time that nurses have gone on strike in the history of the NHS. The sticking point is nurses have complained about their working hours. Many work 12-hour shifts, which can be very difficult, particularly in a high-stress job. But the thing on the table right now is pay. Nurses are asking for a 19.4% pay rise. Now, while that sounds like it may be a little bit greedy, nurses over the past decade or so have received pay rises that are so low that they haven't kept up with inflation. So between 2010 and 2019, inflation-adjusted wages for nurses has actually fallen between 5 and 6%. Inflation in the UK now above 10%, closer to 11%. So what the nurses are saying is, yes, this sounds like a very big number, but we're playing catch up. We have not had above inflation pay rises in nearly a decade. On the other hand, the government is saying not a word of it. Rishi Sunak, the prime minister, was on television earlier to say, and he said, happy to speak to the nurses, but we are sticking with a 4% pay rise. That was recommended by what's called the Independent Pay Review Board. They have recommended a 4% pay rise. Rishi Sunak says the government isn't going any higher. He says going any higher could be more, it could exacerbate inflation even further.
And Laurie, of course, beyond the nurses, a sort of winter of discontent because other workers are also taking action in Britain.
Absolutely, Charles. I mentioned rail workers. I mentioned postal workers, border force patrol going on strike this week. So it really is another winter of discontent. Let's put it in perspective, though. The strikes that have been announced so far, there should be about 1 million days lost to strikes in the month of December. And that's the highest since 2011, the highest in a decade. In fact, the Office for National Statistics had even stopped compiling that data because we had seen so few strikes over the past decade. But if we go back to the last winter of discontent in 1989, in that year, we saw roughly 13 million or just under 13 million days lost a month to strike. So we're nowhere near what we were seeing in 1989.
And Laurie, we've got less than a minute or so left. Sam Bankman-Fried says he will accept extradition to the US.
That's what he says, and it's been a little bit ropey. He said he was going to, then he wasn't, now he was. I have not seen any news yet that he has left the Bahamas, which is where we see him now, where he has been detained. The other news with Sam Bankman-Fried is he was a massive political donor, second biggest donor to the Democratic Party. A lot of those people to whom he donated are now trying to give their donations back. And in fact, the liquidators of FTX are trying to claw back that money as well.
Okay, Laurie, thank you very much indeed. Laurie Laird is Arise business correspondent, and she was talking to me there from